The last thing Matthew felt was the cold. Not the cold of the Abyss dungeon's stone walls, though those had never been warm. Not the cold of fear. Fear had left him years ago. This was something deeper. The cold that spreads through a body when it has lost too much blood to keep going. His stomach was gone. He registered the fact the way a man registers rain. Distantly, without panic. The master of the Abyss had moved so quickly he hadn't seen the strike. One moment he was standing at the edge of the final chamber, the last of his companions alive around him. The next he was on his knees, staring at the ruined floor. Around him, they were already dead. He had watched them fall over the past hour, the greatest hunters alive, men and women who had carved their names into legend, and the Abyssal Master had taken them apart as if none of it mattered. Matthew didn't let his gaze rest on their bodies. Grief was a weight he couldn't afford right now. Sarah was the last to go. He had known her for nearly 2 decades. She had always been the steadiest person in any room, the one who thought 3 moves ahead and never wasted anything. Even now, face bloodied and mana nearly gone, she managed to smile at him from across the chamber. She said something. Her voice was too quiet to carry over the Abyssal Master's movement, but he could read her lips. She was apologizing. He wanted to tell her not to. He wanted to say they had simply met something too large to kill, that none of this was failure, but his arms had stopped responding 3 minutes ago. Sarah raised her hand. Even emptied, even with nothing left but scraps of power, she was gathering something, a gift he had known she carried, but had never seen her use. The air around her turned white. Her miracle. He had never understood what her miracle was. He had never asked. He understood now. The light hit him like a wave, and the chamber dissolved. The last thing he saw was Sarah's face, calm and exact, as the Abyssal Master moved again. Then darkness. He woke up crying. That was the first surprise. The crying wasn't grief. It was the involuntary, urgent announcement of a newborn's lungs, a room smelling of antiseptic and cut flowers, and a body so small that the concept of combat seemed like something from a different world. Matthew could do nothing to stop the noise. He had been conscious for perhaps 10 seconds and had already lost control of his face. He was not in the abyss. He was in a hospital. He was also, based on the size of his hands and the impossible distance of the ceiling, approximately 1 day old. Several helpless, infuriating minutes passed before he understood what had happened. His pathways were real, the mana was real, but everything housing them was starting over. Soft skin, uncoordinated limbs, lungs that did what they wanted regardless of instruction. When he tried to push mana through his hands, it moved like water forced through cracked clay. Present, but completely wrong. A face appeared above him, young, exhausted, overwhelmed in a way she was working hard to conceal. His mother, Tracy. He had not let himself expect that. In the life he remembered, Tracy had died when he was 6 years old. She and his father and his sister had all died on the same night, when a monster broke through the residential district containment, and nobody reached them in time. He had come home to find the apartment destroyed. He had stood there long enough to understand what he was looking at, and then he had closed his face against it and never fully opened it again. But Tracy was here, alive, holding him against her shoulder with the careful grip of new mothers, like something precious she was still getting used to having. The tears that came were appropriate to a newborn, which was convenient. John appeared behind her. Matthew's father had his collar already loosened and his jacket folded over one arm, which meant he had come straight from work when the call reached him. He looked at his son the way people look at things they hadn't known they needed. They named him Matthew. He turned the name over quietly. In the previous life he had been called many things. Undead, mostly, for the way he absorbed damage that should have killed him and kept moving. He had forgotten there might have been something before it. Matthew. He decided it was fine. The work started within the week. There was nothing to do while he was an infant except observe and practice. His mana channels were underdeveloped. He was 1 week old. But they were his channels, and he had spent 30 years learning to read them. He began running quiet circulation loops during the long, silent hours in his crib. No techniques, no combat forms, just careful, controlled movement through his body. Foundation work, the kind that looked like nothing from the outside. He was not impatient. He had spent 4 years preparing for a single dungeon in the previous life. A few weeks in, he noticed Anna. His sister was 3 years old. She wandered into his room one morning and stood at the edge of his crib and looked at him with the focused intensity toddlers bring to things they find genuinely interesting. Matthew looked back, and then he felt it. Passive mana radiating off her body like heat from a furnace door left open. Steady, enormous, completely uncontrolled. He had met perhaps 5 people in his previous life who carried mana at that level. Every one of them had changed things. Anna was 3 years old, and nobody in this family had any idea what she was holding. Matthew filed that knowledge quietly, and watched his parents love her completely, while understanding almost nothing about her. The mana screening system would eventually flag her numbers. It would route her toward proper training. The system worked, slowly and imperfectly, the way all systems do. What no screening protocol would ever detect was what Anna actually had. He had watched a miracle for 3 seconds at the end of his life. He had seen what it did to a chamber full of creatures that should have been unkillable. That same architecture was sitting inside his 3-year-old sister, unprimed and untrained, ticking quietly. He started teaching her mana-breathing exercises within the month. He framed it as a game they played together, which was accurate in the loosest possible sense. She thought it was funny that her baby brother was so serious about a breathing game. He let her think so. His grandmother lived 2 hours away by train and called Tracy every Sunday morning. Matthew had heard her voice through the phone speaker a dozen times before they finally met in person. When he was 3 years old and walked into her apartment for what was, to her, the first time. She crouched down to his level and asked him seriously if he had been a good boy. He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded. She smiled and pinched his cheek with considerable force. This was, apparently, affection in her vocabulary. He could have lived without it. He minded it less than he let on. Her apartment smelled like medicinal plasters, and the red bean pastries she kept in a tin on the second shelf. That specific smell was the first thing he had allowed himself, across 30 years and a second life, to call entirely his. Years passed in that rhythm, training in secret, watching his family, learning to be a child without anyone noticing he was not. By 5 years old, he could perform basic mana wrapping on his hands without visible strain. He practiced during bath time, where his hands stayed hidden under the water, and during the long afternoon hours when Anna napped. He had also been quietly assembling useful objects: heavy craft scissors from the kitchen drawer, a utility knife from his father's toolbox, a coil of thick wire from a delivery package. He kept them rolled inside a gym sock, under a loose floorboard he'd reinforced by hand. He wasn't preparing for anything specific. Experienced fighters don't wait for something specific. They prepare, and then they wait, and they are usually right too. The monster incidents near their district had been climbing. Small ones, Class 9 mostly, the kind that contaminated drainage systems and killed pets and got handled by low-rank hunters without anyone paying attention. But the pattern was too regular, too consistent. He filed it away and kept watching. Kindergarten arrived. The social dynamics resolved in approximately 3 days. A boy named Kevin had decided, with the complete confidence of someone who had faced no real consequences, that Matthew's lunch was more interesting than his own, and took it. Matthew looked at him steadily until Kevin put the lunch down and found somewhere else to be. It was a look he had used on dungeon bosses and armed soldiers. It worked on Kevin too. After that, nobody bothered him. He made friends anyway, which was an accident he hadn't predicted. A girl named Catherine sat beside him during craft hour and handed him the scissors when needed and took them back without ceremony. She was left-handed. He adjusted his workspace automatically. She noticed, he noticed. Neither of them mentioned it. That small mutual attention was the beginning of something he hadn't expected to find in an elementary classroom. Olivia arrived through Catherine. Loud, cheerful, wrong about very little. Jimmy collected monster trading cards with systematic seriousness. Matthew liked all 3 of them, which was an unusual experience. In the previous life, he had learned to function without liking people. He was getting used to this version instead. His father announced they were taking the train to visit grandmother Eunice the weekend before the Kraken. Matthew packed the night before. He rolled the scissors and the knife inside the gym sock, tucked it under his water bottle at the bottom of his backpack. He was not expecting an incident on a 2-hour journey to visit his grandmother. He packed anyway. Tracy checked his bag in the morning and found nothing suspicious. The train left on time. Anna fell asleep against their father's arm. Matthew watched the Han River slide past the window and thought about nothing in particular. The route, the distance, the specific creak of his grandmother's hallway floor, until the train crossed the Manhwa Bridge and something changed. He felt it first through the seat. A deep, rhythmic pressure, very large and very regular. Then the announcement. Then the screaming from outside. He was already at the window when the Kraken surfaced. Class 3. Its main body was still half submerged, but what was visible, the broad flat head, the limbs reorienting toward the bridge deck, was larger than their train car. One arm had already collapsed the median barrier, another was probing the structural supports on the left lane. Class 3 containment required S-rank response, which would arrive in 6 to 11 minutes depending on how quickly the emergency protocol triggered. Matthew looked at the arithmetic and didn't like it. He told his father, flat and direct, to stay inside the car and keep Anna still. John looked at him the way parents look at 6-year-olds who use adult authority. He didn't move. He also didn't argue, which was the important part. Matthew unzipped his bag, took out the gym sock, pocketed the knife, held the scissors with the blade down in his right hand, pushed the emergency door open, and was through it before anyone could think to stop him. The bridge was chaos, people streaming past him toward the station end, abandoning cars, and he cut against the flow, low and fast, reading the terrain ahead. Delivery truck on its side to his left. 2 sedan roofs crushed flat beyond it, then a gap, then the concrete barrier at the bridge's edge. The creature's nearest arm swept the road 30 meters ahead and threw concrete across both lanes. He adjusted his angle and kept moving. The Kraken was targeting infrastructure, weight-bearing columns, support pylons. If he could pull its attention onto something mobile, he could stop the structural damage for the minutes he needed. A Class 3 monster did not hunt individual humans. It wouldn't expect one to approach. He climbed the truck, crossed the sedan roofs, reached the concrete barrier, and activated Heavenly Step. The technique had 2 uses in this body, maybe 3 if he pushed. The channels weren't wide enough for more. The first activation launched him off the barrier with 4 times the force his legs alone could generate, and he caught the leading arm with the open scissor blade, dragged it across the skin as hard as he could, and jumped back before the recoil. The creature turned, its head, that broad, expressionless mass of cartilage and clustered eyes, rotated toward the small figure that had just stabbed it. Humans fled. Humans did not run toward it. He had its full attention now. The second arm swept the road where he had been standing. He moved to a car hood and held position while both reaching limbs reoriented toward him. 1 minute gone. Maybe 2 bought. He counted down from 11. The arm came down again, faster than expected. Secondary speed adaptations, which meant dungeon exposure, which was information for whoever wrote the incident report. He used the last activation at the exact moment of impact, slid 2 meters sideways along the barrier, and the arm cracked the road surface beside him with enough force to knock him off the barrier anyway. He landed hard, rolled, came up with the scissors still in his hand and no mana remaining anywhere in his body. The arm was already rising. Then the light arrived. It came from behind him, an enormous pressured wave of mana, the largest he had felt in any living body, and he turned to see Anna standing on the roof of their train car in her small coat, hands pressed flat together at her chest, eyes completely empty of expression. The wave expanded from her without aim or target. Where it caught the smaller organisms the creature had shed, they dissolved. Where it struck the leading arm directly, the Kraken screamed. A sound Class 3 monsters were not supposed to make. The wave stopped. Anna dropped sideways. Matthew was already running. He caught her before she hit the metal roof, settled on his knees with her weight in his arms, and waited for his breathing to slow. Below the bridge, the main body was retreating, sliding back toward the river, limbs pulling in from the damaged spans. The emergency vehicles were already visible on the far approach. 3 S-rank units, moving fast. They would handle the rest. He stayed on the roof and held his sister and did not allow himself to think about how close any of that had been. Tracy reached him through the emergency hatch, and when she gathered both her children at once, Matthew pressed his face into her shoulder and let go of something he had been carrying for 30 years. His family was alive. The arms around him were real. Anna was breathing, beginning to stir with a small sound against his side. Tears came and he let them come. Nobody questions a 6-year-old crying into his mother's shoulder after a sea monster. It seemed appropriate. His grandmother was standing at the platform when they came through the gate. She had heard the bridge alert on the radio and taken a cab, and she stood very straight with her hands clasped while she scanned the family. John, then Tracy, then Anna, wrapped in a borrowed emergency blanket. Last of all, Matthew. Something moved in her face. She crossed the platform in 3 steps and crouched down and looked at him the way she always had, in every version of his life, like she was reading something in his face that other people couldn't see. She asked if he was hurt. He told her no. She told him he had leaves in his hair. He reached into his bag and produced the carnations he had made the week before. Tissue paper, Catherine's technique, slightly crushed from the journey. He held them out. His grandmother looked at them for a long moment. Then she took them and tucked them into her cardigan pocket without making anything of it. She put her arms around him. He hadn't predicted that. She smelled like medicinal plasters and red bean pastry, exactly as he remembered, exactly as she always had. That was enough. That was everything. Yuna of the 12 Thrones filed her report 4 days later. She had arrived with the 2nd Response Unit during the cleanup, taken one look at the bridge aftermath, and followed threads that led inevitably to the train car roof and 2 children who had no business being there. She interviewed the family separately and without warning. When she reached Matthew, she sat across from him in a plain chair and spent a moment not saying anything. He waited. She told him she was going to file an incomplete report. Nobody would be asking Anna questions for the near future. It would be very convenient if nothing comparable occurred in a location with active camera coverage. Matthew told her that sounded reasonable. She studied him for 1 beat longer than necessary, then filed the report that credited the Kraken's retreat to the combined multi-response team. No mention of a 6-year-old on a bridge with craft scissors. No mention of a 3-year-old generating a mana wave that made an S-rank monster scream. Anna's screening results came back 3 weeks later. The technician called a supervisor. The supervisor called another. Anna was classified as an anomalous high-output latent carrier and scheduled for advanced assessment. That evening, Matthew's parents discussed it quietly while thinking he was asleep. His father's voice carried equal parts pride and worry, mixed the way parents mix them when something extraordinary is happening to their child and they can't quite see where it ends. Matthew could see where it ended. He had watched Anna's channels develop for 3 years. The assessment would tell his parents she was remarkable. It would not tell them what she actually was. That wasn't something screening equipment could measure. He kept the knowledge filed, restocked his hidden kit. The scissors had been lost on the bridge, which he had anticipated, and had replacements already identified, and returned to his morning routine. Mana circulation, exercises, breakfast with his family. 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday, he walked into kindergarten and smelled sulfur. The smell was faint but unmistakable. Sulfur, underneath the wax crayon and dried glue scent of the classroom. Matthew set his bag down without rushing. He moved his chair slightly to give himself room to stand quickly, and scanned the room. 23 children, 3 exits. His teacher, a woman named Cho who kept a small cactus on her desk and graded worksheets, with an enthusiasm he found genuinely baffling. The sound came from the hallway. Something heavy and dragging, the kind of weight distribution that meant either a large box or something organic. Goblins moved that way when they were hunting in enclosed spaces. He stood up. He told his neighbor, a boy who had once tried to bite him during a sharing disagreement, to stay seated and keep everyone quiet. The boy blinked. Something in Matthew's voice produced the same effect it had produced on Kevin and the lunch. He sat back. Matthew reached into his bag and found the replacement knife. Through the narrow window in the classroom door, he could see the hallway empty from this end. Around the corner, something was crouching, too large to be a student, one shoulder visible, greenish, textured, knobbed at the joint in the specific way of low-classification goblins adapted to confined environments. Class 8, most likely, maybe 2. They wandered through rift fractures that opened without warning in poorly sealed underground zones, following smell rather than sight. A school smelled like children. Goblins found that encouraging. 2 goblins in a kindergarten hallway was something a D-rank hunter could handle in 3 minutes. Matthew was 6 years old, working with a utility knife, and had not been a D-rank anything in roughly 2 decades. He opened the door quietly. The nearest goblin heard the click and turned. Matthew was already moving. He activated Mana Wrap on his right hand and forearm. A thin layer, nothing that would register as a power signature at distance, just enough to give the blade real force, and went low as the creature lunged. The knife was not a hunter's weapon. It was made for cutting packing tape. Against a goblin's neck, at the right angle, applied with the force of a trained arm and wrapped grip, it was sufficient. The creature went down. The second one was bigger, and it had a length of metal pipe that it swung the moment it registered movement. Matthew ducked under the arc, felt the air move above his head, and went sideways along the wall to close the distance fast. He got inside the swing radius, which was the one place the pipe couldn't follow him, and drove the knife upward twice. Both goblins down in under 40 seconds. He straightened. His shirt had something on it. He pulled off his outer jacket, a layer Catherine had teased him about wearing in warm weather, which he had kept wearing precisely because it was something he could remove, and bundled it around the knife. He tied the bundle with the spare shoelace he kept loose for exactly this kind of contingency. His classmates were still seated. His neighbor was gripping the table edge with both hands. Teacher Cho had moved to the back of the room and was clutching the cactus from her desk, which was not a useful defensive tool, but appeared to be instinctive. Matthew came back inside, told everyone the noise was finished and that they should wait for the announcement, picked up his worksheet, and continued the alphabet exercise. The emergency alert came 6 minutes later, when a custodian found the hallway and the school locked down. The incident report listed the goblins as neutralized by the automated containment seal on the north corridor, a seal that did not exist, but which the investigating hunter had apparently been too pressed to verify. Nobody asked why Matthew's jacket was missing. The years between kindergarten and elementary school moved at the pace childhood always moves when you are paying attention to something else. His mana channels widened as his body grew. By 7, he could sustain mana wrap for 4 uninterrupted minutes before the strain showed. By 8, he was running heavenly step sequences in the backyard at 5 in the morning, when the neighborhood was dark and the window facing the yard stayed unlit. He kept the sessions short and left no impression in the grass. His mother asked once why he was always up before the sun. He told her he liked the quiet. She said she understood the feeling and brought him warm water with lemon, which became a standing arrangement he hadn't expected to enjoy. Elementary school arrived in spring. New building, new social geometry, new things to map. He identified the exits and the load-bearing walls in the first 2 days, and the always unlocked storage room at the end of the east corridor by the 3rd. He met Sarah on the 4th day. She sat alone in the far corner of the classroom, organizing her pencil case with the systematic care of someone raised by a parent who also organized things precisely. Her father, Matthew would learn, was a potion researcher, one of the few people in the country doing serious development work on enhancement elixirs rather than standard recovery production. She had grown up around careful measurement. It showed. Sarah noticed Matthew's eraser had rolled under his chair without him noticing, picked it up, and placed it on his desk without comment. He nodded. She went back to her pencils. That was sufficient for both of them. Claire arrived 3 weeks later, transferred from a northern district school closed after a dungeon breach. She walked slightly apart from the other students, keeping herself near the edges of rooms the way people learn to do when they've been pushed out of the center enough times. She was a half-breed, human mother, non-human bloodline from her father's side, visible in the faint iridescence of her eyes and the fine structure of her hands. Matthew had known people like her in the previous life. The treatment they received was ordinary and consistent and dressed in polite-sounding explanations, and he had no patience for any version of it. When 3 boys cornered Claire during afternoon break and began explaining to her why she should find a different lunch table, Matthew appeared behind them. He didn't say anything threatening. He asked one of the boys a pleasant question about their homework at a normal volume while standing slightly too close. The boys scattered. Claire looked at him. He sat down across from her and asked if she had tried the fish rice. She said it was fine. He said the seasoning was off. She considered that for a moment and agreed. They ate lunch together from that point forward. Catherine found them the following week and joined without asking. Jimmy and Olivia arrived by the end of the month. The lunch table established itself. The school trip was to the nature park east of the city, organized, approved, located well outside any mapped dungeon zone. Matthew had noted that last point the day the permission slips came home. Dungeon maps updated quarterly. The previous quarter's data was already 3 months old. He packed accordingly. The day was warm and clear, the kind of weather that made supervision easy and danger invisible. He walked the forest trail with Catherine and Claire, listening to the guide explain regional tree species in the monotone of someone who had given this speech several hundred times. He could scan a wide perimeter while holding a conversation without either task suffering, which was one of the uses of good training that nobody around him would have guessed. He smelled the hellhounds before he heard them. The guide was mid-sentence about silver birch bark when Matthew took Catherine's wrist and stepped off the trail, pulling her into the tree line. He told her to get everyone low and move toward the trailhead, not away from it, and to go now. She stared. He held her gaze for 1 second. She moved. The first hellhound came out of the undergrowth at the trail bend 30 seconds later. Class 6. The size of a large dog, black-furred, heat shimmering off its coat, moving with the loose coordinated pace of pack hunters who had already chosen a direction. 3 visible. He read the sight lines and placed the 4th in the brush to his left. His classmates were not fully off the trail yet. Matthew stepped onto the path. He had a folding knife this time, bought from a hardware stall 2 years ago with accumulated birthday money, kept in his bag inside a sleeve he'd cut from an old wallet lining. He opened it one-handed, activated mana wrap along his forearm, and placed himself between the pack and the retreating students. The pack leader hadn't moved. It was the largest one, standing at the back, reading him. This was calibration, deciding whether the small figure in the path was prey or threat. Most prey ran. Running triggered the chase, and the chase was how most encounters ended badly. Matthew stood still and breathed and let the leader finish its assessment. It charged. He was already sideways when it arrived. Not heavenly step, he needed that for later. Just mana wrap on his feet. Weight shifted ahead of the leap. The leader's shoulder caught him and sent him back 2 steps, which he absorbed and used to reset his position. He had driven the knife into its left shoulder on the way past. Not a killing blow, but the animal's front stride shortened immediately. The second hound came from his right. He dropped low, let it clear his head, came up behind it. The third followed immediately after, and he misjudged the timing by a fraction. Took a glancing blow across his ribs that spun him into a tree trunk. His back hit the bark hard. He pushed off without stopping. Pain was information. He didn't need to process it further. The 4th came from the left, out of the brush. He caught it with mana wrap at full extension, something he couldn't have managed 6 months ago. The channels had grown enough, and drove it down. Followed through, stood up. The leader was still moving, circling with its speed reduced by the shoulder wound. Matthew closed the distance before it could fully reorient and finish the engagement properly. 4 down. He straightened and checked the trail. His classmates were at the tree line, silent. The guide hadn't moved. Claire was the only one looking directly at him, her expression something he couldn't name. He folded the knife and put it in his pocket. Behind him, the air crackled. High-frequency mana displacement, the signature of a transit gate. A hunter arriving fast. He turned and found a woman landing 20 meters up the trail in a white combat vest, reading the scene with the professional assessment of someone who had done this hundreds of times. Yuna. He had not expected to see her again this quickly. She took in the trail, the downed hellhounds, the students at the tree line. The 8-year-old standing in the middle of the aftermath with blood on his collar. Her expression remained exactly as it had been when she walked through the gate. She told the guide to escort the students to the bus and wait there. She waited until they were gone. Then she looked at Matthew and said they needed to come to an arrangement. He said he was listening. She told him she was going to ask one question, and he needed to answer it honestly. He nodded. She asked him who he was. He thought about it. Then he told her he was a student at Haiyang Elementary School, currently 3rd grade, with a B+ in mathematics. Yuna held his gaze for a long moment. Then she told him she was going to continue filing incomplete reports and that it would be very convenient if he stopped doing things in front of witnesses, and that if he was ever in genuine trouble, he should use this frequency. She gave him a card. He took it. She left without filing anything that mentioned his name. The arrangement held for several months, right up until the day Lara arrived at school with the news that her father was going to close the East Campus. Lara was not someone Matthew had spent much attention on. She was loud in the specific way of children who had been told their opinions mattered more than other people's, and she had moved through the class's social arrangements with the efficiency of someone who treated friendships as positions. She hadn't directly targeted Matthew, which he attributed to the fact that he had never reacted to her the way she expected. What she had done was make Claire's experience consistently worse than it needed to be. Pointed remarks about her eyes, deliberate exclusions at group activities, the careful social arithmetic of someone who understood how to make a target feel unwelcome, without leaving obvious marks. Matthew had noted it and waited. Direct confrontation with Laura would have required explaining things he preferred not to explain. Her father was the one who changed the calculation. Harry Choi was the chief executive of KK Pharmaceuticals, a mid-tier company with contracts across 3 school districts, which was why he had been invited to the Autumn Sports Day as a community sponsor. He was compact, well-dressed, and moved through rooms with the ease of someone who had spent years measuring them and finding himself at the top. He arrived with Laura and 2 assistants and spent the first 40 minutes making remarks to the principal that were technically courteous and practically instructive. Matthew crossed paths with him near the refreshment table. Harry had been watching him for a few minutes before Matthew noticed, the way certain adults watch children who seem interesting for reasons they haven't identified yet. Laura was nearby. When Matthew reached past her to take a cup of water, Harry stepped forward and made a sharp, dismissive comment about Matthew's posture, his uniform, the general impression he gave. Matthew turned and looked at him. He said nothing. He was 8 years old in a school gymnasium, and Harry was a pharmaceutical executive, and the geometry of the situation was clear. Harry took the silence as an opening. He moved to grab Matthew's shoulder, the correction grip adults use when they want to establish something, and that was when John appeared. Matthew's father was not a physically large man. He was lean and quietly contained and almost never raised his voice. But he stepped between Harry and Matthew with the stillness of someone who did not need any of those things. Harry started to explain who he was. John told him he knew exactly who he was. Then John told Harry who he was, his title at Sirius Company, which was one of the 2 largest conglomerates in the country, and also the parent organization of the subsidiary that managed the pharmaceutical contracts Harry's company depended on. He stated it plainly and without heat. Harry went still. John told him his daughter owed Claire an apology, and that whatever impression he had formed about Matthew's family in the last few minutes had been formed in the wrong direction. He picked up Matthew's cup of water, handed it to him, and suggested they all enjoy the rest of the event. Laura apologized to Claire with tears running down her face, which was more emotion than the occasion strictly required, but which Claire received with grace. Harry made a phone call immediately after, visible through the gymnasium window, hunched, gesturing, explaining something complicated to whoever was on the other end. Matthew drank his water. His father had not seen what Harry tried to do. John had simply arrived, read the room, and acted the way fathers act when something is wrong. He put his hand on Matthew's shoulder afterward, gently, the actual version, and asked if he was all right. Matthew said he was fine. He meant it more than he could easily explain. The Dawn Mall was a 30-story retail and entertainment complex in central Seoul, and they went on a Saturday in November because Mie wanted fabric from the specialty market on the 6th floor. Mie was not technically his aunt. She and Tate, Matthew's mother's cousin, a martial artist of considerable ability who had spent the previous 3 years finding creative reasons to stay close to her, had been inseparable for a while now. Mie had come from Italy, from a family she didn't discuss, and she had built a life in Seoul that she valued more than anything that came before it. Matthew liked Tate. He was the kind of person who didn't ask unnecessary questions, which was rare. He was also the kind of person who could break a load-bearing wall with his hands, which was occasionally relevant. The mall was crowded for a Saturday. Exits would be slow, sightlines short. Matthew cataloged both as they rode the escalator from the ground floor, holding a bag with the drawing set Anna had requested for her birthday, listening to me describe the fabric shop with the focused enthusiasm of someone who had been thinking about this visit for 2 weeks. He felt the mana spike before any alarm went off. Wrong in the specific way that Rift activation mana was wrong. Abrupt. Pressured. Not the gradual accumulation of a natural dungeon signature. Someone had opened a gate inside the building. Multiple gates, based on the distributed pressure he was reading from 2 floors below. This was not an accident. This was not an accident. Matthew turned to Tate, keeping his voice low and level. He told him gates were opening below them. Multiple, not random. Someone had placed devices. Tate's expression shifted into something that had nothing to do with fabric shopping. He told Mie to take Anna toward the north stairwell and hold the landing. No escalators, no lifts. Mie had heard that specific tone in Tate's voice before. She took Anna's hand and moved without asking for clarification. The screaming started on the floor below. Matthew went over the railing. Not a jump, a controlled drop, heavenly step activating on the way down to redirect his momentum against the next level's balcony rail, which he caught with his right hand and used to swing himself onto the floor below without hitting the ground at full impact. Around him, shoppers were already running toward the exits. The gate was in the central atrium, two of them, side by side, crackling with the sour electric smell of forced-open rift energy. Someone had brought in military-grade portal devices, the kind that required significant planning and significant money, and aimed them inward. Things were coming through. He read the first wave quickly. Class 7 bipedal runners, fast, thin, adapted for pursuit rather than strength. A dozen already through and more behind them. His attention moved to the devices themselves. They were anchored to the atrium's central support column, roughly bolted, with a power core that had a visible status light cycling green. Someone was maintaining the connection remotely. Tate landed beside him 3 seconds later. His shoes made no sound. He looked at the gates and then at the runners fanning out across the floor and exhaled through his nose. He told Matthew to take the left cluster and he would take the right. Matthew said he would take the devices. Tate looked at him for a moment with the particular expression he reserved for things that were technically the correct call and also slightly alarming. Then he turned left and his forearms ignited, a low blue-orange flame that ran along his skin without burning it. His gift, the one Mie had once described to Tracy as the reason she had never been seriously afraid of anything since meeting him. Matthew had 2 elixirs in his jacket pocket. He had carried them since he was 7 years old. Small recovery vials, the kind sold at licensed hunter supply shops and technically restricted to registered players, which he had acquired through a process that required no explanation. He took one now and drank it standing, which produced a brief heat through his chest and cleared the residual strain from the heavenly step activations. He moved for the column. The devices had a manual override on the right panel. He had read the model's documentation out of professional habit after the bridge incident, because he had suspected portable rift tech would become a problem eventually, and eventually had arrived. The override required a code he didn't have, but a code input panel ran on a processor, and a processor had a power line. He went in low, under the running cluster that Tate was already dismantling with brutal efficiency on the right side, reached the column, found the line, and disconnected it with the knife. The status lights went red. The gates began destabilizing. Not immediate, there was a 30-second buffer before they closed, enough for another half wave to get through. He moved away from the column before the next group arrived. Something was watching him from the upper floor. He registered it the way he registered most threats, peripheral, instinctual, without stopping to confirm it. A figure in a gray jacket leaning on the balcony railing 2 floors up, perfectly still in the middle of a building full of running people, watching the atrium, watching him. The figure was holding a tablet device that probably connected to the Rift systems, which meant this was nameless, or someone who worked directly for him. Matthew filed the face and kept moving. He had the floor to handle. Tate was not someone who needed help. His martial form was built for close-range groups, and the runner creatures, however fast, moved in readable patterns. Matthew took the right flank where a cluster had gotten past Tate's initial sweep and were heading toward the sealed shop front where approximately 40 civilians had locked themselves in. He arrived before them, placed himself in the corridor entrance, and worked through the problem methodically. It took 4 minutes. The gates destabilized at 2.5, cutting the inflow. After the last runner went down, the atrium was quiet except for the alarm system and the distant sound of more hunters arriving through the building's external gate point. 3 units, probably by the sound. He looked up at the balcony. The gray jacket was gone. Tate came to stand beside him and looked at the closed gates. He remarked, almost conversationally, that somebody had put a lot of money into killing people today. Matthew told him the person responsible was still in the building. Tate said they would deal with that next. They didn't find Nameless. By the time they reached the north stairwell where Mie and Anna were waiting, the coordinating figure had slipped through an emergency exit that the response units hadn't sealed quickly enough. The investigation would run for 3 weeks and produce a name. Nameless was an alias, professionally maintained, the kind that belonged to someone who had done this more than once for more than one client. The case stayed open. What Matthew took from the incident was not the open case. It was the face on the balcony, stored with the careful permanence of a man who had learned that people worth remembering had a way of coming back. The Mahoon family arrived in Seoul 8 weeks later. They came quietly, which was how certain kinds of European organized power preferred to travel. 2 representatives listed as Italian cultural attachés, with diplomatic accommodation and invitations to 3 government functions, and nothing in their paperwork that suggested anything other than a routine liaison visit. Their real business was Mie. Matthew learned this from a fragment of a phone call he overheard while waiting for his parents at his father's office. Mie's voice, clipped and controlled in the way people speak when they are afraid and refusing to show it, talking to someone who responded in accented Korean that the family had not forgotten her. He put that fragment beside the things he already knew about Mie's past. She had been born into a family that treated women as arrangements to be made. She had come to South Korea 7 years ago and built something else entirely, and had been building it every day since. Tate was part of that building, the most important part, visibly. Matthew had watched them long enough to understand that the specific way Tate looked at her when she wasn't looking had nothing performative in it. The Mahoon family wanted her back. Albert came first. He was heavy-set, silver-haired, and smiled with the ease of someone who had always had more leverage than the people across from him. He arrived at Tate's apartment building with 2 assistants and the composure of a man delivering an instruction rather than making a request. He told Mie her family missed her. He told her the arrangements from before were still valid. He told her she had 1 week to consider her position. Tate closed the door in his face. Albert did not take that as the end of the conversation. 3 days later, while Tate was at his Tuesday training session, 2 men arrived at the apartment and told Mie she was coming with them. She fought. She was not a trained hunter, but she was not a passive woman, and the 2 men were professionals. They had a third waiting at the elevator. She was in a car before she had a door unlocked. Tate came home to an empty apartment and a broken lamp. Matthew was there within the hour. The Alice Hotel stood 12 stories above a commercial district in Mapo, the kind of place that priced itself for diplomat-level guests and corporate retreats, and asked no questions about the nature of the bookings. Albert had taken the top floor. The second cultural attaché, Susan, S-rank classification, listed on the player registry under a different name for a different country, occupied the adjacent suite. Matthew sat in Tate's car outside and went through his remaining elixirs. 2 standard recovery vials, 1 enhancement elixir he had never opened, and a small glass cylinder no larger than his thumb that he had been carrying for 2 years in a sealed sleeve at the bottom of his bag. Shadow Spider Extract. Class 5 creature-derived, refined. The kind of compound that in a large enough dose caused immediate cardiovascular shutdown, and in a small enough dose produced muscle paralysis beginning at the extremities. He had acquired it because the previous life had taught him that there were categories of opponent against whom physical engagement alone was a losing calculation. Susan was S-rank. He was 8 years old. He told Tate the plan in 3 sentences. Tate listened without interrupting. He asked 1 question, about Matthew specifically, whether Matthew was going to be all right in there. Matthew told him he would handle Susan and that Tate should focus entirely on Albert. Tate looked at him the way he had looked at him in the mall atrium, that specific expression. Then he said all right and got out of the car. They went through the service entrance. The staff elevator held them as far as the 11th floor, and from there, the stairwell to the penthouse level was a single locked door, which Tate handled by pulling the frame out of the wall, setting it aside, and continuing up. The hallway of the top floor was quiet. 2 guards outside Albert's suite, private security, not hunters, which told Matthew Albert was confident enough in the hotel's location and his own status that he hadn't felt the need to upgrade. A third figure waited outside Susan's door, and this one had a posture that told a different story. Player trained, relaxed in the specific way of people who don't worry about things approaching from hallways. Matthew took a different route. Tate walked forward, which made the guards react, which occupied their attention, which was all the time Matthew needed to slip along the wall and through the fire door to the exterior service balcony. Susan's room had a window. He applied the second enhancement elixir on the balcony and felt it move through him. Not the clean, controlled warmth of a recovery vial, but something hotter, more aggressive, pushing against the limits of his channels in a way that was briefly uncomfortable and then resolved into a 4-minute window of significantly elevated output. He wrapped his hands and feet fully, opened the window latch with the knife, and went inside. Susan was standing at the far end of the room. She had heard the window. She was already turned toward it, her mana gathering, and she looked at what had come through her window, and her expression moved through several things quickly before settling on contempt. She told him they had sent a child. She said it in Italian first, then in Korean, as if she wanted to make sure he understood how he was being dismissed. Matthew crossed the room at half the speed he could have. He let her read the approach, let her form the opinion she was already forming. She fired first, a compression burst, high velocity, the kind of attack that didn't require aim because it filled the space ahead of it. He went low under it, which she had accounted for, and the follow-up was already moving. He took the hit on his left forearm rather than his torso. The impact was significant. He rolled with it, came up against the wall, and the moment she adjusted position to track him, he threw the glass cylinder. Not at her, past her, against the wall to her right, where it broke. The shadow spider compound was odorless, and became airborne on contact with open air. He had already wrapped his own face with a light mana seal, which cost him part of the enhancement window. Susan didn't know to do that. She cast another burst at him while he was against the wall and the compound was already dispersing, and the burst grazed his side and cracked 2 ribs. He stayed standing. She cast again, and her right arm didn't quite finish the motion. Susan looked at her arm. She looked at Matthew. Her mana output was still high. The compound worked on muscular conduction, not on the mana system, and she was trying to compensate by pushing power into her movements. But compensating for your limbs not fully responding while fighting someone who was waiting for exactly that was a specific kind of problem with no good solution. He crossed the room. She fought him. She was S rank, and even paralyzed by degree, she was more dangerous than most opponents he would ever face. And she drove a knee into his broken ribs once when he came close enough that he had to step back and breathe through it. He noted the ribs. He set the information aside and came back. The vial in his right hand was the second recovery elixir, with the needle modified using a syringe cap he had attached 2 years ago and twice tested on leather. He got it into her left arm in the space of a second when she committed to a guard break. The compound in the vial was not poison. It was an amplifier that accelerated the shadow spider compound's existing effect from gradual to immediate. Susan sat down on the floor. She said something in Italian, short and precise. He thought it was probably an observation about the situation, rather than a request. But he didn't speak Italian well enough to be certain. He retrieved the situation calmly, took the documents he could see in the open briefcase on the desk, anything with Mie's name on it, anything that looked like a legal arrangement, anything stamped with the Mahun family crest, and left the room by the door. The hallway was different than he'd left it. The guards were on the floor. One wall had a new entrance that hadn't been architectural before. Through it, Tate was standing in Albert's suite with his flame aura cooling, looking down at something. Albert was against the far wall. Structurally speaking, he was in the wall, or at least the portion of him above the waist had been introduced to it with enough force that the plaster had formed a rough impression. He was conscious. His shoulders were not positioned in a way that suggested they would be comfortable for some time. Mie was standing near the window. She had a bruise along her jaw and was holding it with one hand and looking at Albert with an expression that was very calm, in a way that had nothing calm in it. Tate crossed to her and put his hand on the back of her head, gently, not saying anything. She leaned into it slightly. Matthew set the documents on the table. He told them they should leave before the hotel's security system finished cycling back online. He had disabled the top-floor camera relay before coming through the window, but the lower floors would be active in 4 minutes. Tate looked at the documents. Then he looked at Matthew's side, where the impact from Susan's follow-up burst had stained the jacket. He asked if Matthew needed a hospital. Matthew told him the ribs were manageable, and that he had taken worse at the Kraken Bridge, and that they should go. Tate held his gaze for a moment with the same look he had given him in the mall and in the car outside. Then he picked up the documents, put his free arm around Mie's shoulders, and they walked out. In the car, Mie was quiet for most of the drive. Near the end of it, she said something to Tate in a low voice. He answered in the same register. Matthew didn't try to hear what they were saying. Some things were between two people and worked better that way. The Mahun family did not send another representative to Seoul. The documents Matthew had taken included the legal framework underlying their claim on me, and John's legal team, contacted through a careful chain that didn't require explaining the hotel, filed the relevant counter-instruments through European commercial courts within 6 weeks. Albert was detained by the Italian authorities for matters that predated his visit to Korea by several years, which appeared to be a coincidence and probably wasn't. Susan's status on the player registry changed from active to inactive. No incident report was filed. No Korean hunter was listed as involved. Matthew's ribs healed in 3 weeks. He spent the recovery time doing mana-channel exercises that didn't require physical strain, and reading the quarterly dungeon mapping update that suggested the Gwacheon Reservoir area was producing elevated monster activity. He filed that away. The 12 thrones were already handling the reservoir. A coordinated clearance operation was underway. 3 senior members, including Grace and Greg from the Eastern Response Division. It went well, according to the official report. Completely resolved. Except the official report noted, in a footnote that most people didn't read, that one offspring-class creature had exited the reservoir zone before containment sealed and was unaccounted for. Matthew read the footnote twice. He had learned a very long time ago that the things nobody thought worth tracking were exactly the things that showed up later in expensive ways. The Lizard King, that was the species name in the monster registry, a mid-sized predator with exceptional speed and a heat-resistant hide, could survive months in urban drainage systems. It would surface eventually, drawn by density. He started checking the park systems near their district. He found it on a Wednesday afternoon. The park on the east side of their residential block had a maintenance shed, a dry fountain, a stretch of open grass, and a drainage channel running underneath the eastern path that emptied into the old storm system. Matthew had mapped the drainage the previous spring as a matter of habit. The Lizard King's track pattern was visible in the channel's concrete lip if you knew what you were looking at, which he did. He came back on Thursday morning before school. He was 9 by now. His channels had widened again over the winter in the gradual accumulated way of children whose bodies grew whether the occupant wanted them to or not. Heavenly Step was sustainable at 4 activations before real strain. His knife had been replaced twice. He was currently carrying a short hunting blade purchased from a licensed outdoor shop with Anna's birthday money, repaid in full through a small side arrangement he had with Jimmy's older brother who needed worksheets checked. The Lizard King came out of the drainage channel at 6:43 in the morning, when the park was empty, except for one elderly man doing slow exercises near the fountain. Matthew got between them. The creature was fast, faster than its registry classification suggested, which supported the idea that it had been feeding since the reservoir. Its hide turned the first 2 knife strikes without damage. He adjusted. He went for the joints, which were softer, and for the eyes, which were soft everywhere, and he used Heavenly Step to stay ahead of its speed advantage until the 3rd activation, and then relied on mana wrap and positioning. The fight lasted 11 minutes, which was 3 minutes longer than it should have been, and 2 minutes shorter than he had prepared for. The Lizard King died at the edge of the fountain basin. The elderly man near the fountain had at some point moved behind the maintenance shed and was now visible, looking at Matthew from around the corner, with an expression that combined extreme alarm and what appeared to be honest admiration. Matthew wiped the blade on the grass. He told the man the creature had escaped from the Gwacheon operation and that the response teams would want to know its location, and that the easiest way to report it was the emergency hunter line. The man said he would do that. Matthew thanked him, put the blade away, and went home to change before school. The Sirius Company's executive gathering was held in a tower in central Seoul that Matthew had passed 100 times without entering. His father attended annually and had never brought him before. The invitation this year came from Chuck directly, the company chairman, a heavy-set man in his 60s who wore the same watch every day, apparently having decided at some point that the energy spent thinking about watches was better directed elsewhere. Matthew liked that immediately. The gathering was formal by design and easy by intent. Long tables, good food, alliances being built in the language of casual conversation. John moved through it with the quiet confidence of someone who had earned his position slowly and felt no need to announce it. Chuck found them near the windows. He was larger than Matthew had expected, wide through the shoulders, and he crouched down when he reached Matthew's eye level, which not every adult remembered to do. He asked Matthew what he thought of the view. Matthew said it was a good vantage point. Chuck laughed with the quality of someone who found something genuinely funny. Agnes was across the room when Chuck summoned her, a year older than Matthew, standing with the composed stillness of someone who had attended enough adult events to know where to stand and when to stay quiet. She crossed the room without hurrying and looked at Matthew with the measuring directness of someone who had already sorted most people into useful or scenery and was still deciding. Chuck explained, in the low practical tone of someone used to making proposals, that their children ought to know each other. His interests in Sirius were adjacent in ways that would matter more in 10 years than they did now. He said it without pressure. Matthew said he agreed. Agnes said something brief and appropriate. Matthew said something brief and appropriate back. Neither of them committed to more than that, and neither of them needed to. Chuck watched the exchange with the expression of a man who had confirmed something he already suspected. John said nothing but looked satisfied on the drive home. The mosquito outbreak began in late January, with reports of residents in the Dobong district acting strangely. Not violently, strangely. Moving too slowly, speaking with increasing difficulty, skin acquiring a grayish quality that the initial reports attributed to a viral infection. 3 people had been admitted to hospital within 12 hours. A 4th had walked out of his apartment into the middle of a street and stood there with his arms at his sides until someone called the emergency line. Matthew followed the reports and recognized what the health authority did not. The symptom profile was not viral. He had seen mana corruption mutations in 2 dungeon ecosystems that had broken containment in the previous life, and the presentation was specific: skin tone, motor impairment, progressive acceleration toward a point the host did not survive, a mana-draining parasite, feeding on the host's power and converting it for its offspring's use. He mapped the probable nesting zone against the water system documentation he had pulled during his Guashan research. An abandoned water tower at the district's northern edge, unmaintained for 8 years, with underground access to the old drainage network. He went alone, at night, while his parents believed he was asleep. The creature was larger than his estimate, 2 meters of wingspan folded, more extended, and it moved in complete silence, which meant enhanced mana absorption, sound cost energy, and suppressing it at that size indicated a level of biological refinement he hadn't expected. He spotted it resting on the water tower's inner wall from the access hatch, spent 3 minutes mapping its position and the angles, then entered. The fight was not clean. Its first pass knocked the metal rod from his hands and left a burning mark along his shoulder where contact had been made. Mana drain on touch, which was a problem. He adjusted his wrap to full coverage and felt the drain attempting to find purchase and sliding off instead. Point breakthrough on the 3rd approach. He drove the blade through the creature's mana core, and it convulsed, lost altitude, hit the floor. He stood over it and got his breathing back under control. Outside, against the water tower's base, something moved. He turned, and it was not a second creature. It was a boy, 8 years old, perhaps 9. Barefoot, wearing a coat 2 sizes too large with someone else's name written on the inside collar tag in faded marker. He was sitting with his knees drawn up and his arms wrapped around them, and his skin had already started to change. The gray quality, beginning at his fingers, moving upward along his hands. He had been near the creature long enough. The infection was past the first threshold. Matthew crouched in front of him. The boy looked at him without fear, which was the hardest part. He looked at Matthew the way children look when they have already accepted that adults in their life have limited power over things. He asked Matthew his name. Matthew told him. The boy said his own name was June. Matthew asked him quietly if he understood what was happening to him. June looked at his hands for a moment. He said he felt strange. He said it didn't hurt yet, but he thought it was going to. Matthew told him plainly that it would get worse, and that once it crossed a certain point, there was no way back from it. June took that in without argument. He asked if Matthew was going to help him. Matthew said yes. June looked at his hands again. Then he asked if Matthew could make him smile first. He said he wasn't sure why he was asking. He just wanted to. Before, Matthew had nothing prepared for that. He had spent 30 years as a weapon and 9 more years becoming a person again, and he was not someone who made people smile on demand. He looked at June and thought about what he had in his pockets, which was a blade, 2 spent vials, and the small stone Anna had painted for him at the start of the month, during the week when she had decided rocks were a good canvas. She had painted faces on rocks for the entire family and distributed them with great ceremony. His had a lopsided circle with dot eyes and a mouth that curved up at the corners, slightly crooked, the way Anna always drew smiles. He took it out and held it up without explaining it. June looked at the rock. Something shifted in his expression, surprise maybe, at the smallness of it, or at the seriousness with which Matthew was presenting it. He smiled. Small, unsteady, real. Matthew put the rock back in his pocket. He picked up the metal rod from the tower floor. June had closed his eyes. Matthew stayed close and made sure June did not have to wait long. Near the end, June said something very quietly. Matthew caught the word at the center of it. The word most people said when they were very young and something was wrong, because it was the first word most people learned for that feeling. He stayed with him until it was completely over. Then he sat against the water tower wall for a while in the dark, and didn't think about anything specific. He was 9 years old and he had done what needed doing, and that truth sat beside the other truth the way true things sometimes did, without resolving each other. He was cold by the time he stood up. He didn't let himself think about the name in the collar on the way home. He had learned that lesson early in the previous life. Not that it stopped being heavy, but that choosing when to carry something and when to set it down was a skill. He set it down. He would pick it up again later, in some quieter moment, and sit with it properly. For now, the sky at the district's edge was starting to lighten. He made it back to his bed with 7 minutes to spare. The health authority reported the Dobong cluster resolved 2 days later. The official explanation was a parasitic organism that had self-neutralized. Matthew did not correct it. He kept Anna's painted rock in his left jacket pocket from that point forward. Spring arrived fast that year, and with it the announcement of the elementary school's annual interclass sports festival, an event that, according to Catherine, was the most significant thing that would happen until graduation. Matthew did not share that view but understood its logic. Catherine had strong opinions about relay composition. She organized the class with the efficient authority of someone who had been born knowing where people belonged, which the rest of the class had apparently accepted years ago as simply how Catherine was. She put Olivia at the anchor because Olivia was the fastest, Jimmy at the second exchange because Jimmy was reliable under pressure. When she reached Matthew, she asked his preference, and he told her wherever she needed him, and she studied him for a moment and put him at the start. Claire asked to help with preparation. She said it from the edge of the group, positioned for the possibility of refusal in the way she still positioned herself sometimes, out of habit built over a long time. Catherine looked at her and said obviously, and what did she think about the baton exchange timing, because she had been turning it over all week and wanted a second opinion. Claire blinked, then she sat down beside Catherine and they talked about the timing for 20 minutes. It was a small thing. It was not a small thing. The festival ran across 2 days in late April. The school grounds were reorganized into lanes and stations. Parents lined the boundary ropes. The specific energy of the event was one Matthew had not experienced in either life before. Competition that was real, and stakes that were simultaneously everything to the people inside it and gentle in the larger world, which turned out to be a combination he found he could tolerate. Laura's class had won the previous 2 years. She made sure everyone was aware. Matthew ran the first relay leg and passed clean. Transition exact. The result of years of controlled movement that had been built for purposes that had nothing to do with sports days, but served this one anyway. Olivia closed the anchor with a stride that brought them in first by a margin that was not dramatic but was clear. They took the obstacle event, the tug competition, the cooperative carry, placed second in the jumping relay, which produced a brief period of Catherine displeasure before she decided the wind conditions were a mitigating factor. Agnes was in the crowd, brought by her father's assistant to observe the school she would join in the following academic year. She watched the proceedings with the measuring attention she brought to most things. When the final scores went up and Matthew's class placed first overall, her eyes found him across the field. She gave a small nod. He returned it. Laura's class placed third. Laura's expression went through several stages and landed on something controlled and distant, which was more composure than Matthew had previously credited her with. Claire was standing in the middle of the group when the announcement came through. Catherine had pulled her there, not loudly, not with any performance of it, just a hand on her wrist and a slight tug inward before the numbers finished posting. 2 weeks earlier, Claire's mother had called Catherine's mother and suggested politely, and at some length, that perhaps the friendship between their daughters wasn't in Catherine's best interests, given certain considerations. Catherine's mother had listened carefully and said she would think about it. She had then made Claire's favorite dish on a Saturday and brought it to the apartment where Claire had been spending afternoons, and left without making anything of it. Catherine had not mentioned any of this to Claire. She had kept eating lunch at the same table and arguing about relay timing and being, in the uncomplicated way of someone who didn't understand why it should be otherwise, simply a friend. Claire stood in the middle of the celebration and let it happen around her. Matthew watched from a few steps away. Catherine was telling Olivia something emphatic about the anchor leg. Jimmy was explaining the exact sequence of the tug competition to someone who had been present and witnessed it and did not need the explanation. The afternoon sun had gone low and turned the school track gold. He hadn't expected to have this. He had come back with a specific and limited goal, keep his family alive, and had kept it, and everything else had arrived alongside it without announcement. Catherine, noticing, he adjusted for her left hand. Claire at the edge of the lunch table, beginning to move toward the center of it. Anna painting faces on rocks and distributing them with great ceremony. His grandmother's arms around him in a train station. His mother's voice finding him across a crowd. He had been a weapon for so long that he had forgotten what being a person felt like from the inside. He had thought the shape of it was gone, but the shape turned out to be specific and findable. It was Anna, explaining the breathing game he had invented with the gravity of someone sharing genuine discovery. It was Tate's expression when confronted with things that were correct and alarming in equal measure. It was his father stepping between him and a man who thought he was a target, quietly, without needing to raise his voice. He smiled. Not the calculated version he produced when the situation required it. The real one, which had been in storage for 3 decades, came out now in the middle of a school track with gold light on it, without him deciding to allow it. Jimmy noticed and looked concerned. He asked Matthew if he was all right. Matthew told him he was. He meant it in a way he hadn't meant anything similar in as long as he could account for. Jimmy considered this. Then he returned to explaining the tug competition to his unneeding audience. Matthew let the afternoon run. He was 9 years old. His family was alive. His friends were celebrating around him. The sky over the track was clear and settling toward evening, and he was present in it, rather than running calculations behind it. That was not the whole picture. He was too honest with himself to pretend it was. Nameless had a face and no address. Anna's miracle was growing and unregistered. The monster classifications were trending upward in the quarterly reports. The world did not pause because a school festival had been good. But this moment was real, and it belonged to him, and he filed it the way he filed useful things, carefully, in a place he could locate when the next hard stretch arrived and he needed to remember what he was building toward. His mother's voice eventually reached him through the noise. He picked up his bag and walked toward her. She put her hand briefly in his hair, absently, the way she did sometimes without meaning to make anything of it. He did not correct the gesture. He walked alongside her as the track emptied and the afternoon folded into evening, and he was, for the first time in either of his lives, simply a child going home.